Welcome back to Too Young To Grieve. And today's episode feels pretty crazy to me because somehow we've reached episode 35 of this podcast. So I thought for episode 35, we'd do something a little different. 35 grief lessons from 35 episodes of Too Young To Grieve. Not because I have grief figured out, I don't think anyone does. And I'm far from having it figured out, believe me. But because after 5 years of grief, now hundreds of conversations and thousands of messages from this community, there are definitely things that I've learned that I wish someone had told me earlier. So that's what I want to do today. So let's start there. Because we've now spoken to therapists, psychologists, authors, founders, campaigners, and people from every possible grief experience imaginable. People who've lost parents, children, partners, siblings, friends, people grieving deaths, people grieving futures, people grieving versions of themselves. And the funny thing is that despite every story being completely different, certain themes keep appearing. The details change, the person changes, the circumstances change. But underneath it all, there are just these shared truths that keep coming back again and again when it comes to grief. And honestly, when I started this, I don't think I'd ever imagined that we'd get here. At the start, Too Young to Grieve was really just me trying to make sense of my own grief, trying to find language of things that I couldn't explain, trying to understand why life felt so different after losing my dad, and trying to create the kind of conversations that I wish I had access to when everything felt confusing. So I hope that this episode today helps with that. So here's 35 lessons that I've learned so far. Let's begin with a very important lesson. Number one, grief changes your identity way more than people realize. And this is something that we have spoken about so much on the podcast. And there's a reason for that. Because I think before loss, I assumed grief was mainly emotional, sadness, crying, the things you see in the films, missing somebody. That was my understanding of it. But nobody really prepares you for how much grief changes the way you experience yourself and the world around you. I remember after loss feeling like I couldn't fully reconnect to the version of me that existed before it happened. And I was frustrated because that's such a strange thing. Because from the outside, your life can still look fairly normal. You go back to work, you reply to messages, you go out for coffees and birthdays and dinners and all the normal things that life has because there's no other option. You just have to keep going. But it's the internal impact because internally, it's like that perspective and lens that you see life through has just completely shifted. You start noticing things differently, become more aware of time. Certain conversations, surface level things just stop mattering. Certain people just stop making sense to you anymore. You just don't understand them. And your priorities change without you even trying to change them or even wanting to. And I think, especially when grief happens young, it matures you really quickly in a way that can feel very isolating, as we often discuss. Because suddenly you're carrying perspectives and fears and emotional awareness that most people your age haven't really had to think about yet. They're still going out, partying, focusing on things that young people naturally do. And I think that's why so many grieving people say, I just don't feel like myself anymore. Because honestly, you're not the exact same version anymore. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing either. I just think it's one of the hardest realities of grief that we have to accept. And that leads me on to the next lesson. That is very hard for people to understand that functioning in grief doesn't always mean coping. And this is probably one of the biggest things that I've learnt from my own grief journey, from doing the podcast, from the community, that some of the people struggling most mentally are often the people functioning the best externally. I've spoken to people who are running businesses, training every day, building careers, posting online, smiling socially, and helping everybody around them, while privately they are carrying enormous amounts of pain internally every single day. And I think grieving people become very good at wearing that grief mask that we talk about, performing that normality, because life doesn't stop for you. The bills still exist, the work still exists, family responsibilities, friendships, deadlines, all of these things. The world keeps moving, whether you feel emotionally ready or not. And that's one of the hardest things about grief, because that creates that weird disconnect where people assume, oh, well, they're working, they're replying to my messages, they're out, they're doing things, they seem okay. But the thing is, seeming okay and actually feeling okay are two completely different things. And one of the things that grief has taught me is how invisible that suffering can be. You never really know what somebody is carrying. You don't know what happened before they got to work that morning. You don't know what anniversary they're approaching. You don't know what memory they woke up thinking about. Only the other day, I went for a walk, and first thing in the morning, I saw someone that used to go down the tennis club that my dad used to play at. And instantly, I was reminded of my dad within 10 minutes of waking up. So you don't know what people who are going through grief experience and how they feel, but they seem like they're normal because they're doing the things that you have to do in life to survive. Unfortunately, we can't just stop after grief. And that's hard because you don't know what they're trying to hold together. And for me personally, and a lot of people that I've spoken to, I honestly think that's made me much softer as a person. Not because grief makes you kinder automatically. If anything, people probably think that it would do the opposite. But for me and for many others that I've spoken to, once you've carried something so heavy yourself, you realize how many other people are probably carrying those things too. And you don't want them to ever experience that grief, the pain that you've experienced. So it makes you a bit softer. Grief changes your friendships more than people expect as well. And that's lesson number 3. And this has probably been one of the biggest recurring themes across Too Young to Grieve. And I don't think people realize how much that secondary grief can come from relationship or friendship changes after loss. Some people you thought would always be there disappear completely. Some avoid the topic entirely because they don't know what to say. Some clearly just slowly distance themselves as a result. And I think that what makes that painful isn't even necessarily the anger that you have towards that person for pulling away. It's that disappointment, because you suddenly realize that certain people can't emotionally meet you where you need them to. And that's so hard. But weirdly, grief also brings incredible people into your life that you never expected. People step up, people that you didn't expect step up. You meet new people and you instantly get along because they understand the pain that you've experienced. And those people suddenly become some of the safest spaces that you have. I've seen that happen countless times through this community, through the in person meetups. And I think that's because grief exposes emotional capacity more than anything. Some people are just capable of sitting with that pain and discomfort and difficult emotions, difficult topics, things that we say as someone who's experienced grief. And some people just genuinely aren't capable of doing that. And that's so hard because you thought that they would always be there to listen, there to support you, there to understand. And I don't think that that makes people necessarily bad people. I just think that culturally, we're just not taught how to handle grief very well. We're taught how to celebrate things, how to achieve things, how to fix things, but grief cannot be fixed. So when someone doesn't have a solution to the pain that you're feeling, they don't know what to do. And that leads them to just slowly pull away. When in reality, with grief, sometimes all we need is just your presence and just you saying that I'm here for you. And weirdly, that's what so many people struggle to give. The next lesson is that there is a difference between distracting yourself and healing. And that's something that I've only recently realized over the last couple of years. Because for me personally, I think for a long time, I confused movement, I confused working, distracting myself with progress on my journey. Well, I was just posting on social media, I was running marathons, I was doing all these things, keeping busy, working constantly, going to the gym, always having plans. And I thought that was productive. And look, sometimes staying busy genuinely helps. I would say in the first year, just surviving, getting through the grief, keeping yourself occupied does help sometimes. And sometimes that survival mode is necessary. And routine gives your brain that stability when everything internally feels chaotic. So it can be useful at points. But it is important to understand that there's also a difference between coping and constantly just outrunning your emotions, sometimes literally. And I think a lot of us grieving people are scared of just staying still because that stillness is where we're left alone with our thoughts. And as we all know, that grief gets louder in that silence. And that's why so many of us suddenly just emotionally crash months or even years later in my case. When life finally slows down enough for you to actually be able to process what happened, it catches up with you. I've heard this so many times on the podcast from the community. People saying that I thought I dealt with it. And then suddenly, years later, something hits them emotionally out of nowhere. A memory, a song, whatever it is, comes up. And those emotions just come out of nowhere. But honestly, I don't think that grief disappears just because you've distracted yourself successfully for a while. I think that what happens is emotions wait until your nervous system that's been in that fight or flight, that occupied mode, finally feels safe enough again to process them. And that can be so hard. And also, modern life makes this harder because we live in a culture that constantly rewards distraction. There's always another notification, another task, another goal, another thing that's taking your attention up. But sometimes sitting with grief almost feels rebellious in that world that wants you to just stay busy, to stay occupied, to always be doing something. But sometimes we just need to sit with it and feel it. And when you're ready, that's a great thing to do. And only when you're ready. Lesson 5 is more specific to men. As a man who talks about grief and emotions, it can be viewed as weird. It can be difficult for some. But one thing I've noticed through myself, through conversations with male guests, is that grief in men often doesn't look emotional in the way that people expect it to. Sometimes it looks like working non-stop, moving, doing things all the time, training harder, staying busy constantly, never just slowing down, never fully opening up emotionally, talking about how we're feeling. And I think a lot of men get labeled as fine simply because they're still functioning externally and they look fine from the outside. But as we discussed previously, functioning and processing grief are completely different things. And I also think a lot of men don't necessarily have the language for what they're carrying emotionally. We've never sort of been taught that as men. We just sort of continue, be the strong man, don't talk about things, don't cry. So instead of speaking about grief directly, we channel it physically or internally. We do things like marathons, high roxes to distract ourselves. Those endurance challenges, the gym, the running, or staying constantly occupied with work can become such a big coping mechanism for men after loss, but everyone after loss as well. A lot of us do these things. And it's not necessarily because we're avoiding grief completely, but because sometimes these coping mechanisms, the movement, sometimes it feels safer than being vulnerable. And a lot of the time, I think that men's grief goes unnoticed because society, again, still expects men to appear composed, to appear strong, even when they're struggling massively underneath everything. And I've been guilty of that. Not talking about things, just distracting, just keeping myself busy. And it caught up with me. A lot of men carry enormous amounts privately while still trying to look fine emotionally for everyone around them. And I think that's why these conversations matter so much because silence doesn't always mean that somebody isn't hurting deeply. Grief also makes you aware of time in a completely different way. And that's lesson number 6. I don't think I ever really thought about time properly before grief. Everyone used to say life is short. Everyone says tomorrow isn't promised. Appreciate people while they're here. But most of us hear those things intellectually, really, rather than emotionally. But then grief happens. And suddenly those phrases stop being the typical cliches that we think. You realize one day becomes the last day that you ever speak to someone, that last hug, that last conversation, the last normal moment. And the strange thing is, you never know it's happening at the time. But then that grief awareness, it changes you. It can create anxiety, but it can also create gratitude as well. And I think that grief is one of the few things that forces people to confront how precious, ordinary life actually is. A sunset, seeing the moon, having a home cooked meal with your family, friends. The things that seem so ordinary before grief feel so important after it. Lesson number 7 goes back to the friendship, the relationship aspect. Because, like I said, not everybody who disappears is a bad person. And this one took me a while. Because when somebody lets you down during grief, they don't show up as you expected. It's very, very easy to become angry. And I figured it out myself. People told me, I spoke to people as well. Sometimes that anger isn't completely justified. But over time, I've realized a lot of people aren't avoiding your grief. What they're avoiding is their own discomfort with it, with the topic of death. Loss forces people to confront mortality. It forces people to think that this could happen to them. They could lose someone close to them. And people don't want to think about that. So when you've experienced it, people don't know what to say to you. They don't know, they don't want to talk about those things. And the reason is a lot of the time that they don't even want to think about it themselves. But in reality, by talking about it, by understanding it, by asking you about it, your experience, they can prepare better for it. But that loss forces them to confront the mortality, the helplessness, the pain, the fact that bad things can happen. And some people simply don't want to sit with those realities. And that doesn't make it hurt less for you that someone didn't show up. They didn't ask you about them. They weren't there to support you. That doesn't make it hurt any less. But it helped me to understand it differently. Because often people's response to grief says more about their relationship with pain, with death, with trauma than yours. And it's hard to understand, but it's very useful at the same time. Lesson number 8 is that grief is often far stranger than it is sad. And what I mean by that is I think if somebody who's never experienced grief tried describing it, they'd probably just say, "You must feel really sad." And yes, we do. But honestly, grief is very, very strange. It is weird. Grief is one of the weirdest things that I've ever experienced. It's forgetting for a second and then remembering. You can be in a supermarket, hear a song, and you're reminded of your person. It's seeing somebody who looks like them across the street, picking up your phone before remembering that you can't call them, you can't text them. It's feeling guilty for laughing. It's crying over something completely random. It's being fine for weeks and then getting emotionally flattened by a song in Tesco. Some of the hardest parts of grief aren't even sadness. They're confusion, the contradictions, the surreal moments where your brain just struggles to catch up with the reality of what has happened. And I think that's why people often worry that they're grieving badly, when actually you're just discovering how strange grief really is. And that's tough. And when we talk about strangeness, lesson number 9 is your body grieves too. And this is something I massively underestimated and didn't have a clue about, to be honest. I think before grief, I saw grief as something that just happened in your mind. Again, just sadness, just emotions. You feel sad, you cry, you miss somebody, and that's grief. But the longer that I've had conversations around grief, the more I've realized how physical it actually is. And I didn't realize that in my first year of grief. The exhaustion, the brain fog, the anxiety, the heaviness, the inability to focus on a dissertation that I had to write, the feeling that simple tasks suddenly required twice as much energy as they used to. And I've had so many people message me saying that they thought something was wrong with them. They've spoken to doctors, gone to A&E, called GPs because they didn't know what was going on. Physically, they felt completely exhausted all the time after loss. But the thing is, grief is exhausting. Your brain is constantly trying to process something that has fundamentally changed your reality. Your nervous system is trying to adjust to a world that no longer feels safe or predictable like it did before. And this is why sometimes it is okay to just survive and just get through. Because oftentimes grieving people just need more rest than they think they should. But the thing is, society doesn't allow for that. We understand physical injury. We understand when someone breaks their leg. Nobody expects them to go out sprinting the next day. But the thing is, grief is invisible, isn't it? No one sees it. So people often expect themselves to just perform normally, go back to work and everything be okay, while carrying something so heavy internally. And honestly, for me, I think one of the kindest things you can do for yourself while grieving is give yourself some grace. Don't expect yourself to function exactly as you did before because that's impossible. Your body is physically in fight or flight a lot of the time, and it's impossible to function as you did before. So allow yourself to have some rest sometimes as well because you deserve it. This thing is not easy to navigate. Lesson number 10 has come more recently. At the start of my grief journey, I did not know where to turn, who to talk to, because no one understood me and I didn't get what I needed to do or who I needed to see. I didn't want to see a counselor because I didn't feel ready for it. I didn't even know what day of the week it was. But lesson number 10 is that community heals things that advice can't. One of the biggest things through Too Young to Grieve is that it's taught me that people don't always need advice. Most of the time, we just need connection. When someone is grieving, people often rush to find the perfect thing to say, the perfect quote, the perfect piece of wisdom, the perfect solution. But grief isn't a problem to solve. You can't fix it. And I think that that's where people get stuck because there's no solution to this. We want to feel better, but there's no way to do that. There's no solution for this. But some of the most meaningful moments I've seen through Trying to Grieve haven't been advice or solutions. All it's been is somebody saying, "Me too," or "I thought I was the only one." And there's just something incredibly powerful about feeling understood. Not fixed, not analyzed, not reassured, just understood. Because grief can make people feel like they've become separated from the rest of the world, that they're a bit strange, a bit weird. The amount of times people say, "This might sound a bit weird." Nothing in grief is weird. It's a human response to something so difficult. But you know what? Community helps to bridge that gap. It reminds people that whilst their grief is unique, their feelings often aren't. Everyone grieves differently. But honestly, when you're around people that say "me too," that makes you feel understood. And I think that's why these conversations matter so much, even just hearing it. Not because they remove grief, but because they remove some of that loneliness and isolation that comes with it. Another thing that grief does, and lesson number 11, the best number. Grief can make you emotionally older than your age. This is something I've spoken about with so many guests, especially people who experience loss young. I think grief forces you to ask and answer certain questions on yourself before you're even ready for them. Questions about mortality, about grief, about death. We never expect to even think about these things. Society doesn't teach us to. About time, questions about time, about meaning. What does this all mean to me? Family, how important they are to you. Identity, what is my new identity after grief? Life, what is the meaning of life? What am I actually here for? Most people gradually arrive at those questions through adulthood, just through life, doing it at their own pace, and they'll figure it out eventually. But you know what grief does? It drops those questions right on your doorstep overnight. And that is so difficult because that can create this strange feeling where you don't quite relate to people your own age in the same way anymore. I love my friends. I'll always love them. They're brilliant. But there are certain things that they just don't understand, and that's not their fault. That's just grief. It teaches you things that you can't just learn. And it's not because you're better than them, it's not because you're wiser, but because you've had experiences that just shift your perspective earlier than you ever expected. And I remember after losing my dad, feeling like life had become incredibly real very quickly. The things people worried about sometimes felt completely different to me. Small problems, small issues, but big issues to them just didn't feel the same for me. The conversations that interested me changed. I wanted to go deeper. I wanted to understand people more, talk about deep things. Probably to some people's annoyance because not everyone wants to talk about those things. The things that I valued changed. And whilst there are positives to that perspective, which is hard to hear, I also think there's a loneliness that comes with it. Because that grief can just make you feel emotionally older while still being the same age as everybody around you. And that gap is very difficult to explain. And you know what else is difficult to explain? Moving on to the next lesson, that there is no right way to grieve. And this sounds obvious, but I don't think that most people believe it, especially at the start. I didn't. I was looking for the right solution to this, the right way to go about this. And I think most of us secretly worry that we're doing this wrong. If you cry too much, am I stuck? If I don't cry enough, did I not love the person? If you're functioning, you feel guilty for functioning. How am I just still doing this? And if you're struggling, you feel guilty because you're like, I shouldn't be struggling. They struggled more than me. If they're happy, you feel guilty. Sad, years later, you feel guilty. And it's almost like grief creates these endless opportunities for you to judge yourself, to think you're doing it wrong. But one thing that I've learned through this podcast and through this community is how differently grief shows up in different people. Some people talk, some people don't. They listen. Some people need community. Some people need to be on their own. They need solitude. Some become emotional. Some become numb. Others stay busy. Others don't deal with it as well and potentially fall apart for a period of time. And honestly, all of it can be normal. Because I think grief becomes much harder when we start comparing to other people's experiences of grief. They're they're coping better than me. Why am I not in that position? But grief, it's not a test, it's not an exam. There isn't a correct way to do it, a correct answer. There's just your way. And part of this healing journey, if we call it that, is slowly learning to trust your own experience rather than measuring it against everyone else's. However, you're dealing with your grief is okay. There's no right way to do it. You will get through it. Lesson number 13: grief changes ambition in ways that people don't talk about. And one thing I've noticed through Too Young to Grieve is how differently grief impacts people's relationship with ambition. For some people, that loss, as people often say, the pain becomes power, the loss becomes fuel, become so aware, hyper aware almost of time that they want to just build something. I'm guilty of that. You just want to create something, use that loss, use that pain as fuel to create it, leave something behind, a legacy, a lot of people say. And they stop procrastinating because suddenly life just feels finite. But for other people, grief completely knocks the wind out of ambition. And there's no right way again of how this works. The things that people used to care about stop making sense sometimes. Career goals feel less important. A lot of people change careers or leave their job. Success feels different to them. Everything gets questioned. And honestly, I've felt both at different points. And I'm sure a lot of us have. There have been times that grief has made me way more driven, and other time where it's made me question, what is any of this actually for? And I think that's why it's important not to romanticize the grief fueled ambition too much. A lot of people say things like turn that pain into power, use it as fuel. But sometimes that's not always the case because sometimes grief creates momentum, yes, and sometimes it's very confusing, and both are very normal. And that's just something to consider. The next lesson is that loneliness is one of grief's most hidden struggles. When people think about grief, they usually think about sadness. As we always say, yeah, everyone just thinks grief is just you being sad. But I think, honestly, loneliness is one of the hardest parts. Not necessarily that physical loneliness, it's that emotional loneliness. You know, that feeling that everyone else has just carried on, that people don't understand you, the feeling that you're carrying thoughts and emotions that nobody around you can fully see. And I think that's why grief can feel so isolating, even when you're surrounded by people. Because being around people and feeling understood are two very, very different things. I've spoken to people with huge support networks, including myself, who still feel very lonely. And it's not because people didn't care, but because grief can create a sense of separation from your normal life. And I think that's why finding people who genuinely understand can feel so powerful because it reminds you that you're not alone. You're not alone. And grief sometimes can make you feel that you are. But that genuine understanding reminds you that you're not. Grief also doesn't just change how you see death, it changes how you see life. And that's the next lesson. This is probably one of the biggest things that I've noticed over the last few years. People assume that grief, you've experienced death and loss now. It's going to teach you about that. And it does slightly. But I think it teaches you far more about life and living than it does death. It makes you notice things, the ordinary moments, the conversations, the relationships, the people who matter, the things that don't, the materialistic stuff. It strips away a lot of illusion. And whilst none of us would choose grief, it does give us some clarity on things. You become more intentional, more aware, more conscious of how you're spending your time. Not because you're trying to be deep all the time, but because you understand something now that you didn't understand before. And that's that life is fragile. And once you truly know that, it's very, very difficult to live the exact same way again. And that's something that I'm very passionate about getting across to people who haven't experienced grief. The complaining about small things that won't matter tomorrow, doing things that they're not passionate about. That's something that grief teaches you about how fragile life really is. Lesson number 16 is that guilt shows up in grief everywhere. I think it's one of the most misunderstood parts of grief because people feel guilty for things that they did, things they didn't do, conversations they didn't have, words they didn't say, days that they enjoyed, moments that they laughed. And I'm guilty of that too, of questioning why am I feeling joy today? Feel guilty for it. And what's strange is grief often creates that guilt when there isn't actually anything to be guilty about. But what it is, it's like the mind starts searching for, some control in a situation that was just uncontrollable. Because that guilt feels easier than helplessness. At least guilt, it gives you something to focus on. That's what we think. But one thing that I've learned is that grief is already heavy enough without you having to carry responsibility for things that were never yours to carry in the first place. Just remember that. That's one of the most important lessons that I've learned through this grief journey. The next lesson is that some grief isn't about the past and it's actually about the future. And that was a massive realization for me. I always thought grief was mainly about missing what was. But so much of the grief is actually about missing what was supposed to happen, the future, the conversations, the milestones, the memories that just didn't get to happen, the future version of life that I'd imagined with my dad in it. And I think that's why grief can feel so disorientating because you're not only grieving somebody's absence, you're grieving possibility, years that never got the chance to exist, things that we never got to do with those people that we lost. And that's another part that people around you can't see. They just see you smiling and the success and the good things that are happening, but they don't see that you're carrying a future nobody else knew that you were imagining with them in it. And that was one of the toughest lessons that I learned through grief. The next lesson is a good lesson to come after that one. And I think it's that tough lesson that I've only sort of started to realize now. And that's that grief and joy can coexist together. And this is something that I wish more people would be open to because grief, as I said before, is so heavy without not thinking that you can experience joy again. And it kind of links back to that thing that a lot of us are scared. We're scared that we can actually experience happiness again. Scared that that joy means that we're forgetting them. That moving forward means leaving them behind. But grief has taught me that emotions aren't either or. You can miss somebody and still laugh. You can carry sadness and still have a great day, a great life. You can love someone so deeply and still enjoy your life. And those two things aren't in conflict with each other. And honestly, I think, me personally, and a lot of the people I've spoken to, I think that is one of the most beautiful things I've learned from people throughout this journey is that joy doesn't replace grief. They simply coexist and grow alongside each other. Because there are still times where you can just experience happiness and joy without that grief showing up. And that is a hard lesson, a very hard lesson, and it takes a while to get your head around it. It took me a while. There are still times where I question it, but there are also times where I allow the joy to come into my life because we deserve that. The next one is from a recent guest, Amber, from the Grief Gang. It's that hope isn't something that you find, it's something that you protect. Amber spoke about fighting for grief not to take your hope too. And the more I thought about that, the more I think it's one of the most important lessons that grief has taught me. Because grief can take so much. It can take your confidence, your sense of certainty, your plans, your feeling of safety, your trust in the future. And when you're in the middle of that, hope can feel so far away. And I think some of us imagine that hope is this huge inspirational feeling, but honestly, I don't think it is in grief. I think hope is often much smaller. It's booking something for the next month, a trip, or a day out, or a meal out with a friend, whatever it is. Replying to a message is hope. Making plans with a friend is hope. Believing that life won't always feel exactly like it does right now. Having that hope can help you to get through some of the toughest moments in grief. And I think it's one of the bravest things that we can do as grievers is continue to almost invest in life whilst carrying that uncertainty that we have unfortunately got now. And it's not because certain things will just get better, but it's because we're willing to believe that they might. And sometimes that belief is enough in this tough journey. The next lesson is one that I learned from my friend Miranda. And it's about rituals, grief rituals, something that I was only introduced to recently. But these little things matter a lot more than people realize. You know, the little things like lighting a candle, visiting a place that they loved or you went to together, listening to songs that connect you with them. And also more simple things like going for a walk, wearing jewelry that might have been theirs or something that reminds you of them, ordering a coffee in someone's name, their Miranda special. To someone outside of grief, those things can seem really small. But to us grievers, it makes us understand exactly why they matter. Because grief, it doesn't end your relationship with somebody, as hard as that is. It just changes it. The most common saying I've heard in grief is love with nowhere to go. That love is still there. The connection is still there. Those memories are still there. What changes is how we express them. And those rituals, they create space and somewhere for that love to go. I think that's why it feels so powerful. When I ordered a coffee in my dad's name, I never expected to feel what I felt from that little ritual. So I highly recommend to look into rituals to see what works for you. Not everything will. But if you find something that does, it can create such immense connection, which is so beautiful. Because they're just small acts that quietly say, I still carry you with me. And honestly, I think we underestimate how healing that can be. Lesson number 21. We're getting there. Moving forward and leaving someone behind are not the same thing. It almost relates to that grief and joy. And I think this is something that a lot of us wrestle with. We find it so hard, especially after the first few years. Because eventually life starts asking you things again. Opportunities appear, new relationships, work, new experiences arrive. And alongside that comes this strange feeling of guilt again. Almost like we're moving forward somehow means that we're moving away from that person. But I don't think that's true. I think grieving people often confuse continuing life with forgetting. And honestly, for whoever needs to hear that today, they're not the same thing at all. Because I know people that are way further along in their grief journey than myself. And I've never met somebody who stopped loving someone just because they started living again. If anything, sometimes living fully can become one of the ways that we honor the people that we've lost. Not because that is what grief's for at all, but because the people we love rarely wanted our lives to stop too. And that's so hard. It was one of the hardest things for me to get my head around. But I think that is a very important distinction, that you can carry someone with you while still walking forward as well. And that's very hard. Lesson number 22 is that grief changes relationships long after the loss itself. And one thing people don't always talk about is how grief continues influencing relationships years later. And I'm not just talking about friendships, I'm talking about romantic relationships too, family relationships as well. The way that you attach to people, the way you trust people, the way you communicate. Loss changes all of these things. You know, sometimes you become more protective because you're scared of loss. Sometimes you're more anxious because you're scared of losing them. Sometimes you become more independent because you know that they could be taken away and you want to make sure that you can do this on your own as well. But the biggest thing is that sometimes we do become more fearful of losing people again. And I think a lot of grieving people don't immediately connect those things back to grief. I certainly didn't. Until I spoke about it, I certainly didn't. But they often are. Because once that loss becomes real, your understanding of relationships change. You realize people aren't guaranteed. And that awareness can make the love feel both more beautiful and more frightening at the same time. And I'm not a master at that, and I'm not going to say I am. It's very difficult. And it's one of the hardest things I've had to get my head around. One of the strangest gifts that grief has given me, lesson number 23, is that it can make those ordinary moments feel extraordinary. It's made me appreciate ordinary life differently. Just going for a coffee with a mate, a random conversation, a sunny day. I saw something the other day, a nice sunset. I said it to my mate, and he was like, "What are you talking about?" And that's just grief, changing your perspective on things that are so beautiful that we just avoid when we haven't experienced it. We just rush past it before. But the ordinary things in life are the most beautiful. It's not those end goals that we think. It teaches you how much of life actually just happens in those ordinary days, the random Tuesdays. Not the big milestones, the huge achievements, just everyday life. And when you experience loss, you become more aware of that. You realize that some of the moments you'll miss most one day are the moments you barely noticed beforehand. And I wish that I could just make people who hadn't experienced grief understand that. Go sit and watch the sunset. Watch the stars. Go for a coffee with a mate rather than doing something fancy. There's nothing wrong with that, but the ordinary things sometimes are the best things. The next lesson is again quite a hard one, and it's that grief makes you question every single thing. It doesn't just make you question what happened, it makes you question life, your priorities, your beliefs, your identity, your relationship, sometimes even yourself. And I honestly think that that's a normal response to something that completely changes your reality. But when something significant happens, it does force you to reevaluate things. And the problem is that we often interpret that uncertainty from grief as a failure. We think, I should know who I am. I should know what I want. I should know where I'm going. That is where I'm going. That's the path. The only path for me is that. But grief can shake those foundations completely. And sometimes questioning things isn't a sign that you're lost, it's a sign that you're growing. You're growing with the grief. And that's one thing that I want to, I've said it a couple of times already, but I want you to be able to hear. It's just signs that you're growing. Now, one of the biggest lessons, if not one of the most important ones from this whole episode, there is no finish line to grief. And that's so hard to hear, and it was so hard for me to hear. But I think this might be one of the biggest misconceptions around grief because people often treat it like a process. You know, you're supposed to complete it. Those 5 stages, you're meant to go through them and you'll be fine again. It's as if one day you arrive somewhere and think, right, that's it, done. You know, grief's done. I'm finished. Okay, I'm back to normal. But honestly, after 5 years, after speaking to people who've experienced grief for a lot longer, I don't think grief works like that. I think grief changes. It changes over time. It softens, it evolves, it becomes less consuming. At the start, it is all consuming. But trust me, me being 5 years into this journey, I don't have those moments every single day. They just happen far less often. It becomes less consuming, but it doesn't disappear. And I actually find that quite comforting now because someone said to me a couple of days ago, Tanya said, if, like the film Men in Black, someone came to erase your memory, you wouldn't want that to happen. You wouldn't want that grief to go because all it is the memories. You wouldn't want to stop loving somebody. That was never the goal. The goal was never to erase their impact, the love you had for them. The goal was just learning how to carry their absence alongside your life. And that is very, very different. I hope that lesson has helped in some way to bring you comfort because it completely changed my relationship with this whole journey. The next lesson is that grief, and this is an interesting one, grief makes empathy feel personal. What do I mean by that? Before grief, I think empathy was mostly intellectual for me. You know, someone struggling, you care, you feel for them, and that's it. But after grief, empathy becomes something way deeper because you've experienced what it's like to carry something invisible. You've experienced what it's like to look okay whilst not being okay. You've experienced what it feels like to feel misunderstood. And that changes how you see other people. You become slower to judge, quicker to listen, more aware that everybody is carrying things that you can't see. And honestly, I think that's one of the most meaningful things that grief can teach us. Lesson number 27. Some people, including myself, spend years trying not to feel the grief. And I get it. Grief hurts, it's uncomfortable, it's unpredictable, it's exhausting. So naturally, we look for ways around it. Work, distraction, achievement, relationships, anything that creates distance, we look for that. But one thing I've learned again and again is that grief doesn't really disappear just because it's ignored. It just waits and then it shows up later on. Because eventually it's going to ask to be acknowledged. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not for years. It took me years. But grief has a way of finding its voice eventually and it shows up. And I think that's why it's so important in whatever way you can, whenever you are ready, to create space for it. Because what we often avoid ends up growing louder. And I experienced that. That's why I'm so passionate about creating these spaces where you can just hear people talk about grief. You have the opportunity to talk because that's one of the most healing things that you can do. Next lesson is a reminder that grief isn't a problem to solve. And we touched on it briefly, but it's one of the most important lessons because so much of modern life is built around fixing things. If something hurts, we fix it. If something breaks, we repair it. If something isn't working, then what do? We optimize it. But grief doesn't fit that model because I always say, you are not broken. Grief isn't something broken. It's a response to love. It's a normal human response. And I think people, including myself, become exhausted when they spend years trying to solve this, trying to fix something that can't be fixed, instead of just understanding it. And not every painful thing needs fixed in. Some things simply just need to be witnessed. And grief is definitely one of those things that just needs to be witnessed by yourself and by others around you who can support you through it. We don't need to be fixed. Just need someone to listen and for us to be able to understand it and to feel it and to feel understood as well. Grief doesn't always get lighter. Sometimes you just get stronger, is a great quote that I heard, and lesson number 29. People often ask whether grief does get easier. I've heard it a lot. Does this get easier? And honestly, I don't think there's a simple answer to that. Some parts do. The shock softens. The constant intensity, like I said, it reduces. You learn how to navigate birthdays and anniversaries and things like Father's Day, Mother's Day, Siblings Day. You learn to navigate these things. You learn to build a life around the loss. And that's the important thing, around it. But I don't know if grief itself necessarily just gets smaller. I think sometimes what changes is you. I think you're what's changing. You become more experienced at carrying it. The same way somebody carrying a heavy bag on their back for years is most likely going to develop the strength that they didn't have at the beginning. The weight is still going to be there, but the ability to carry it has changed. And that is the same with grief. And I think that's why people can be 5, 10, 20 years into grief and still have moments that hit hard. But it doesn't mean that they're back at the start. It doesn't at all. It just means that that grief, that love is still present. And that is a very, very different thing. Right, lesson number 30. This was a hard one, but you don't have to find meaning in what happened. This is something I've thought a lot about and I've learned a lot about through the podcast. Because so many people ask questions like, what was the lesson? What was the reason? What was the purpose of this? And honestly, I don't know that every loss has a purpose. I don't think many losses have a purpose. I don't know that every tragedy has a lesson hidden inside it. Sometimes a tragedy is a tragedy. Sometimes awful things just happen and they're awful, full stop. That's it. But I do think a lot of us, including myself, can try and create meaning afterwards. And that's different. Too Young to Grieve has meaning for me. These conversations have meaning. The community has meaning. The events have meaning. But that doesn't mean the loss itself happened for this reason. If my dad could come back, I would do anything for that. And I think that separating those two things can be really freeing. Because you don't have to justify what happened to build something meaningful afterwards, whatever that looks like for you. It can make you feel guilty. Grief can make you feel guilty for living again, for moving forward, for feeling joy, for laughing, for having a good day, for succeeding. You can feel disloyal. And if you've ever felt that, I promise you're not the only one. Because lesson number 31, over the years, I've realized something. Sadness is not what keeps somebody close to you. It's the love that does. Because you don't honor somebody by suffering forever. You honor them through remembering them, through sharing memories, through talking about them, through connection, through carrying them with you in whatever it is you go on to do. And I think that that is a really important distinction because grief sometimes tricks people into believing that pain is proof of love, and we can only show that love by feeling pain. But that is not the case, because you know what? Love existed before that pain, and it still exists beyond it. Please remember that. Lesson number 32 is some days grief doesn't show up, and that's okay. I think a lot of us struggle with that. The idea that every happy moment has to be bittersweet. The idea that we will think about them or want to share a memory every single day. That every good day needs grief sitting in the corner somewhere. But honestly, sometimes grief just isn't in that room. Sometimes you're just having a great day. You're laughing, you're present, you're enjoying life. And for a moment, that grief, the loss, isn't at the center of your experience. And that's okay. Because it doesn't mean that you've forgotten them. It doesn't mean you love them any less. It doesn't mean you're moving on. It just means that you're experiencing new things. You're living. And I think a lot of us need permission to experience joy without immediately looking over our shoulders thinking, I should be feeling guilty for this. You don't need to. And that's a very, very important lesson to hear. A big, big lesson that I want to share. Lesson 33. The relationship doesn't end when somebody dies. I think this is one of the most important shifts in how I understand grief now. At the beginning, grief felt like the separation, like the relationship had just been cut in half. But the longer I've sat with the grief, the more I've realized the relationship continues, just differently. You still think about them. You still hear their voice sometimes. You still ask, what should I do here? What would you think? You carry their values, their morals, who they are in so much of you. Their influence, the humor, the advice. The relationship doesn't disappear. The form of it changes. And a lot of that is through you. And I think that's why things like memories, stories, rituals, why they matter so much is because the relationship don't only exist physically. They exist psychologically, emotionally, spiritually for some people. And I think understanding that changes your relationship with grief completely. The last two lessons, and this one is really important. Lesson 34. Nobody is as alone as grief will tell you you are. This is one of the biggest things that this community has taught me, because grief is incredibly convincing. It's very slight. It tells people nobody understands, nobody gets it, nobody feels this way. Nobody would know what to say. And then someone comes to an event, comes to a run, listens to a podcast, sees a post on social media, and you hear exactly what you've been thinking privately for years. And suddenly you realize, oh, it's not just me. And that is one of the most powerful things from this whole community, is hearing people share their stories and their perspectives and things they've experienced, and someone else saying, oh, it's not just me. They get it. And that is the power of talking about grief, the power of the conversation about death, not because it fixes the grief, but because it removes some of that isolation and loneliness around it. And that matters way more than people realize. So just remember, you are not alone in this grief journey. There are so many other people in this community, in other communities, all over the world that are experiencing the thoughts and the feelings that you are too. And if you can, putting yourself in these communities, in these conversations, will help you so much on your grief journey. And that leads me on to the last lesson. Nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, should have to grieve alone. And that's the lesson I want to finish on. Because if there's one thing that this community, that these 35 episodes, that my grief journey has taught me, is that grief is far more universal than most people realize. The details are different, the stories are different, the relationships are different, but underneath it all, people are often carrying very similar fears, questions, emotions, wondering if they're grieving correctly, wondering if they'll ever feel normal again. If anybody understands this, and that is why spaces like this matter, that is why talking about grief matters. Not because we have all the answers here, but they remind people in a very difficult situation that they don't have to carry everything by themselves. And that feels like quite a fitting place to end episode 35. I hope that this episode helps you find some form of comfort in this journey. I hope it helps you put words to things that you've been feeling. I hope it helps you understand grief just a little bit better. Because we don't understand this ourselves a lot of the time. I don't, but hearing it can help. So if you've listened to the podcast before, shared an episode, messaged the page, come to an event, left a comment, or even just supported Too Young to Grieve in any way, genuinely from the bottom of my heart, and a lot of the people that have been able to discover this, thank you. Because what started as me just trying to make sense of my own grief has become something so much bigger than I ever imagined. And none of that happens without people like you choosing to listen to this, choosing to support the community in whatever way you are. So if you enjoyed this episode, please, it would genuinely mean a lot if you could take a few seconds to follow the podcast, subscribe on YouTube, leave a rating on Spotify, or share it. Just sharing it with someone who might need it. Because that's what this is about. Every one of those things, the follows, the rating, the share, it helps these conversations reach more people who might be feeling alone in their grief right now. And that's what matters. And if there's one thing I've learned over these 35 episodes, building this community, is that nobody should have to carry grief alone.